Welcome back to Power and Politics. The federal government announced this week it will sanction the so-called morality police in Iran in response to the death of Mahsa Amini in police custody and the protests that have subsequently broken out. The 22-year-old had allegedly been detained because she didn't wear her hijab properly. But no list of sanctions, specific sanctions, has yet been published by the feds. And human rights activists say Canada should go further than that and even list the country's IRGC, the regime's special military body, as a terrorist entity. Joining me now to debate whether Canada should, Arif Virani is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade. Melissa Lantsman is the Conservative Party's Deputy Leader, and Heather McPherson is the NDP Foreign Affairs critic. Hello to all three of you. Pleasure to have you here. I appreciate you making the time. Mr. Virani, I'm going to start with you. As I mentioned in the introduction, your government did announce sanctions on the morality police. Why has your government not listed the IRGC as a terrorist entity?
So let me just start by saying, Vassy, that our solidarity and our support is with the people of Iran that are protesting, the women and the men who are protesting the actions that were taken with respect to Ms. Amini. We send our sympathies to them. We stand in solidarity with them and with Iranian Canadians that are launching in similar protests here in Canada. And we support what they're doing. In terms of the IGRC, what's really important for people to understand is that we have declared Iran as a state sponsor of terror. So that's one. The second point is that we have taken actions and punitive measures against the IGRC. And third is that we've listed the Quds force, which is a force within the IGRC, as a terrorist entity. So we're actively taking measures. And as you alluded to, the next step that we will be announcing in a matter of days is sanctions against the dubious morality police because of these heinous actions, these unlawful and unjust actions that they've taken with Ms. Amini and with other Iranian women.
So the Quds force that you're referring to, though, applies to the regime's foreign actions. It doesn't actually apply to the domestic actions, which specifically apply in this case to the crackdown that is happening, the people who have actually died during these protests. So you've explained the things you're doing, but you haven't explained why you're not doing the other thing, which is listing the IRGC as a terrorist entity in and of itself, something the House of Commons actually voted in favor, the Prime Minister included, I think even yourself included, back in 2018. 2018, it's 4 years later. Why hasn't that happened?
So I remember that vote. It's an important vote, and having a focus on the Iranian regime and its state sponsorship of terror is critical, and that's what we're focusing on. What we are doing is we're looking at all avenues where we can take action. The IGRC is an important aspect of that, and the Quds force is a key facet of it. What we're doing is we're taking steps to now impose sanctions, and the issue of sort of the terrorist application to the Revolutionary Guard is something that we're working on quite actively. But we stand in support not just with the people that are protesting Ms. Amini, but also the irresponsible and completely innocent deaths that have taken place.
I take that. I'm going to move on to your colleagues in a second. I just want to make sure I'm clear with our audience. When you say it's something you're actively considering, that means that it's on the table, that your government could list them? And why haven't you in 4 years, though?
We've taken actions with respect to Iran in a number of steps. Vassy, as I was indicated, we have adopted a foreign policy stance that is aggressive towards Iran. We've declared that they are a state sponsor of terror. We've declared and taken punitive actions against the IGRC as a general proposition and against the Quds force. The IGRC, generally speaking, is something that we are looking at pursuant to that motion that was voted on in 2018.
Okay, so Ms. Lantsman, I know your party is in favor of listing the IRGC as a terrorist entity. From the experts that I've spoken to try and figure out why perhaps the government hasn't moved on it, they point to the idea of enforcement and how difficult it would be to enforce. And so if you went ahead with something like this and couldn't enforce it, there'd be a credibility problem. Doesn't that make sense? Wouldn't the government be wise to pursue things it can enforce so that it has the maximum impact?
You're answering for the government, and while I appreciate that, we haven't heard from the government why they haven't listed something that is the will of the House.
I mean, to be fair, I'm not answering for them. I'm just trying to figure out why it's not happening.
This government came in, and about 2 months into their tenure, they started removing sanctions. We started talking about removing sanctions in early 2016. This is a government that hasn't used the Magnitsky sanctions. So either they believe that nobody is a human rights abuser in Iran, or they're not doing anything. The minister came out yesterday and said we are going to list a whole bunch of individuals. It's not that hard. There's a list that exists in the U.S. There's a list that exists with stakeholders. There's a list that we can go over right now. So the fact that they're not doing anything suggests that they're not taking this seriously. There was a 22-year-old girl murdered in Iran, which has woken up the world. There's protests in 150 cities, all 31 provinces, and on every university campus, and including right here in our own cities. So if the government's not, not looking at this is also a regime that shot down a plane, which CSIS has said in a public report, where over 50 Canadians have died. If that's not a terrorist group, I'm not sure what qualifies for this government.
To Mr. Varani's point, it's not that they have done nothing. They have announced these sanctions. They have applied sanctions in the past. They have listed part of the IRGC as a terrorist entity. They haven't yet moved on the overall listing of it. Could there not be a justifiable reason for that?
This is a government that is position came out. They come out and said their position is strong, and their position was weak from the beginning, and it continues to be weak. We're hearing that from the Iranian Canadian community in Canada. We're seeing it. We're seeing it abroad. We are amongst the weakest, and the government still hasn't answered as to why they won't list the IRGC as a terrorist organization, just like the House asked them to, just like they themselves and the Prime Minister voted to in 2018.
But wouldn't you want them to do it to be effective? Like, don't you, like, if in fact it is hard to enforce because you're effectively saying this whole regime and the things that come with it have to be enforced in this country, like, doesn't that make sense?
Actually, there's a big difference between effective and an MP hosting members associated with the regime in their constituency office, like the member from Richmond Hill. His name is Mahid Johari. He's actually involved with the regime. So there's a very big difference between saying you're going to do something, doing something, and what the government is currently not doing.
I just got to weigh in here. I think casting aspersions about a Liberal member is a bit beyond this panel, but what I would show in terms of the leadership that Melissa Lantsman is claiming that we're not asserting, we are leading the coordinating group with respect to the victims of PS 752. That's ourselves, the UK, Sweden, and Ukraine. We've been very vocal on that. Ralph Goodale did an extensive report. We understand that seeking any sort of remedy through this particular regime is futile, so we are seeking legal recourse to ensure that justice is served.
I know you're not,
and
I take that point. I know you're not doing nothing on that file, but I'll also point out that it's the victims, one of whom the families of the victims, one of whom I had on the program last night, who are specifically asking for your government to list the IRGC as a terrorist entity. So I would add that to the conversation. Ms. McPherson, I look back at the record in 2018. I don't believe you were yet an MP, but your colleagues were, and overwhelmingly voted in the NDP against listing the IRGC as a terrorist entity. Was that a mistake?
You know, what I'm looking at right now is what we can do that can be the most useful right now. You know, I do think that there is a lot of rhetoric being thrown around. There's a lot of, I guess, a lot of politicizing of this. What we need to do is figure out the best way to help Iran, the best way to help the people of Iran that are actually pushing for this change. And I think all of us on this panel support the women and the men that are fighting for this change. So we do need to put things in place like sanctions. We know we can enforce them. We know that those can work. I'm concerned because the Liberal government has not shown themselves to be terribly strong at sanctions with regards to Ukraine. I'm interested in us having humanitarian aid go, making sure that's there, making sure that the schemes to help people flee violence in their country to come to Canada are in place, and that we are doing what we can. You know, I think right now to be saying that we should be listing or not listing isn't helping the problem, isn't helping the people of Iran right now. What we need to be doing is looking at what are those things. This is an urgent issue. We need to be looking at those things that can be helping. And humanitarian aid is one of those things, something that I know not all of the members of the House of Commons are interested in. Sanctions are one of those things, something that we can do right now, that we can put in place. And yes, absolutely, we need to be listening to Iranians. We need to be listening to Iranian Canadians. They've been talking to us. I brought forward a motion in the International Human Rights Subcommittee to look at this issue. This is an urgent issue for all parliamentarians, and we should be doing that.
The thing I would say to that in response is, so have we. And they have very specifically been asking for the government to list the IRGC as a terrorist entity. You didn't address that part of the question. I don't think I don't know if it's a zero-sum game. All the things you listed certainly would help and it could happen, but you didn't address why the NDP doesn't support listing it as a terrorist entity.
So from my perspective right now, it's very similar to what you had said, Vassy, is that we don't have the capacity to monitor that, to manage that. We don't have the capacity to do that. The Government of Canada can't do that right now. So absolutely, I agree that we need to look at that. We need to find out if there is an effective way to do that. But in the meantime, let's do what will help the people of Iran. You know, we are supposed to have a feminist foreign policy. We don't have that yet. We do have a feminist international assistance policy. We are not adhering to that. Where's the support for the women of Iran as they fight for their rights? The women of Afghanistan, the women around the world that are fighting for their rights, for that matter.
Mr. Virani, does your government not open itself up to the criticism that the posture you've taken for a feminist foreign policy is on the empty side when, for example, you make an announcement 2 days ago at the UN that you're going to sanction people in the morality police and you have yet to name any individuals?
I don't think so at all. I think the pronouncements that the Prime Minister has made have been welcomed around the planet in terms of feminizing our international aid policy and working towards a feminist foreign policy writ large. Secondly, in terms of what we're doing to support women in the region, we've been supporting women extensively in the region in Afghanistan, both prior to the Taliban, and we're trying to continue to provide aid into the region. I take issue with what Heather mentioned with respect to
providing aid, are you?
If I can just finish, I take issue with what Heather mentioned with respect to we've been weak on sanctions on Ukraine. I think that is just categorically false. Over 1,000 people have been issued or sanctioned in the Russian regime.
My question is about Iran, though, right now, and specifically, you made a point, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, of saying before the UN, we're going to sanction people in the morality police. The U.S. had already done so, and they had produced a list.
Yes.
Your government still has not.
Yes.
2 days later.
And the list of our allies, we like to work in concert with our allies. The list that was used by the United States is something that's informing our decision. It is coming in a matter of days in terms of whom we will be sanctioning. It will be extensive. It will include the morality police, and there will be dozens of others who are leaders of giving the orders to those who are carrying out the actual actions that were taken against Ms. Amini and other women and people that have been killed since then. So it is a work in progress, but it is coming soon, and we're acting with haste because we're listening to the human rights concerns. I share those human rights concerns. I think, Vassy, you know, I came to this role as a human rights and constitutional lawyer. This is important stuff. It's important for women in Iran. It's important for women around the planet. And the fact that women are seized with this issue in Iran and their male allies, that is a good thing, and we want to expose that and capitalize on that momentum.
Do you support their calls for regime change?
I think what's important is that we need to understand that this regime and what they're doing vis-a-vis women, we are very aggressive in terms of indicating that people should not be dictating what women should wear, nor how they wear it. And we've taken that position across the board around the planet, and that is something that the Prime Minister has always articulated. And this applies in that part of the world as it applies here.
So that's not really an answer about whether you support their calls for regime change.
So what I would say to you is that we support calls for taking action against and sanctions against the individuals that were involved.
Does the Conservative Party support those calls for regime change?
Yeah, yes. And if you can't be unequivocal about a brutal religious dictatorship who kills their own people, then I'm not sure what we're all discussing here. That's it's disappointing. It's disappointing to see the Liberals not explain it, not act, not put anybody on any kind of list, and not list them as a terrorist organization. That has consequences in this country, and we're going to stop the flow of money here, and we're going to stop the flow of people coming here that are associated with the regime, who are actually targeting and being very aggressive to the communities here in Canada. We've heard that from the Iranian Canadian community, and we want a government that's going to act on it.
But with great respect, it's not perfectly analogous, but the Saudi Arabian regime also does not have a great human rights track record and didn't when the Conservatives were government and signed a deal to supply them with labs.
Yeah, we've continued to call them out on their role at the UN Human Rights Council, on their role as the head of the women's organization at the UN.
But do you sanction all of them too?
If you can't be unequivocal on listing the IRGC or putting people on a list that list is readily available from the US, from our allies, from the community, from stakeholders, then you're not doing anything at all.
But I'm saying that your government wasn't unequivocal. Your party wasn't unequivocal either when it was in government.
I think this is a very,
and it's not the same. I want to be clear. It's not exactly the
regime.
same thing. It's not exactly the same thing. And the Liberals continued that deal too. So nobody is absolved of anything right now. But I am saying it's not exactly black and white.
and it's not the same.
It's not the same, but it's not like the Saudi Arabian regime there has a great record, or the Crown there has a great record either.
No.
Ms. McPherson, the one thing I feel like you haven't really answered, though, is whether or not your party does unequivocally support, not exploring, but actually applying the terrorist listing.
So for us, I think at this point, what we want to do is what's going to be helping. Now, there's a couple things I want to say. First of all, I want to say, you know what? In Afghanistan, Canadian organizations are not allowed to deliver aid. So that has not been fixed. There is no support for women in Afghanistan. In response to our sanctions issues, we have actually seized $121 million. That is it. That is the sole result of our sanctions on Ukraine. So none of those have been put in place. So I'm saying, put in a sanction regime, enforce it, give it the teeth to do the job that it needs to do. Put humanitarian aid there. Ensure those women can be protected.
It's also difficult to put humanitarian aid in Iran right now. The same issues exist there that do in Afghanistan.
But there is the opportunity to have more work done with women who are on the ground.
And with great respect, that certainly is a set of things the government could consider. Does that mean that your party does not support listing the IRGC as a terrorist entity?
At this point, I'm looking at what we can do that will help the people of Iran most.
But in principle, do you not support it?
You know, it's something I'm going to have. This is going to be part of our study. We'll do that, but I'm not going to declare that right now, Vassy. What I'm going to say is that what can help the people of Iran, what can help women around the world most right now, and that's not one of the things that I think will help women around this world right now.
Okay, I've gone very long on time, but I think it's a worthwhile discussion. So thank you very much, all three of you, for making the time. Arif Irani, Melissa Lantsman, and Heather McPherson.